September 7, 1977. Washington, District of Columbia. President Jimmy Carter signs two treaties that will surrender America's most symbolic imperial possession, the Panama Canal. The political cost is enormous. Carter's approval rating plummets. Conservatives call it surrender. Ronald Reagan campaigns against it, declaring, "We built it. We paid for it. It's ours." The Senate barely ratifies the treaties by a single vote, margin 68-32. Exactly the two-thirds majority required. No room for error whatsoever. And yet, 22 years later, at midnight, on December 31, 1999, the United States formally hands over complete control to the Republic of Panama. This is the paradox, the same United States that refuses to return Guantanamo Bay to Cuba, despite 50 years of protests, surrendered Panama Canal voluntarily. Guantanamo is 45 square miles of unwanted military base that Cuba has rejected since 1959. Costing $4,085 annually in rent, Cuba refuses to cash. The Panama Canal, by contrast, was a 50-mile engineering marvel connecting two oceans, handling 14,000 ships annually, generating hundreds of millions in economic value. So why did the United States keep the worthless base it wasn't wanted at and give up the crown jewel of American imperialism that actually mattered? The answer is simple, cold, and perfectly rational. By 1977, the Panama Canal had become more trouble than it was worth, economically obsolete, militarily useless, politically toxic. This is not the story of American generosity or moral awakening. This is a case study in imperial cost-benefit analysis and strategic abandonment done right. This is the story of why empires don't collapse from external defeat but from internal calculation that the price of holding territory exceeds its value. Let's start with how the United States acquired the Panama Canal, because the original sin of acquisition explains the inevitable necessity of surrender 76 years later. In 1903, Panama didn't exist as an independent nation. It was the northern province of Colombia, called the Department of Panama, economically insignificant and sparsely populated. The United States wanted to build a canal across the isthmus connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, cutting 8,000 miles off the voyage around South America. In January 1903, Secretary of State John Hay negotiated the Hay-Herron Treaty with Colombia, offering $10 million plus annual rent for canal construction rights. The Colombian Senate, seeing the deal as a violation of sovereignty and inadequate compensation, rejected the treaty unanimously in August 1903, killing American canal ambitions entirely. President Theodore Roosevelt, furious at what he called Colombia's homicidal corruptionists, decided that if Colombia wouldn't sell, Panama would simply have to become independent. November 3, 1903, a Panamanian independence movement, heavily backed by American money and the implicit threat of U.S. military intervention, declared separation from Colombia. Colombian troops dispatched to crush the rebellion found the USS Nashville parked in Colon Harbor with orders to prevent Colombian forces from landing on Panamanian soil. The revolution succeeded within hours with 0 casualties. Panama became independent on November 3. The United States recognized Panamanian independence on November 6. 72 hours later, November 18, 1903, Philippe Bunau Varilla, a French engineer with financial interest in the canal who had never actually lived in Panama, signed the Hay-Bunau Varilla Treaty. Bunau Varilla wasn't elected by Panamanians. He wasn't even Panamanian. He was appointed by the new Panamanian government, which owed its existence entirely to Washington's support. The treaty terms were extraordinarily favorable to the United States, $10 million initial payment, plus $250,000 annually in perpetuity for canal rights. The United States received a 10-mile-wide canal zone, stretching 50 miles across Panama, with all the rights, power, and authority within the zone, as if sovereign. The treaty explicitly stated the grant was in perpetuity, meaning forever, with no expiration date, no renegotiation clause, no possibility of Panamanian recovery without American consent. Panama's new government, desperate for American protection against inevitable Colombian attempts to reclaim the breakaway province, had zero negotiating leverage and accepted the terms immediately. The Panama Canal was completed August 15, 1914. After 10 years of construction, involving 56,000 workers and costing $375 million in 1914 currency, over 5,600 workers died during construction, primarily from yellow fever, malaria, and accidents involving the massive excavation of 240 million cubic yards of earth. It was hailed as one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, a triumph of American technological prowess and a symbol of emerging American global power. And economically, for the first 3 decades, the canal was spectacularly valuable to the United States, generating economic benefits several times greater than its construction cost. By 1940, America's national income was approximately 4% higher than it would have been without the canal, an enormous gain from a single infrastructure project. The canal supercharged the growth of California and the Pacific Northwest by making West Coast oil and lumber competitive with Venezuelan oil and southern timber on the East Coast. Before World War II, the vast majority of cargo transiting the canal consisted of American goods. West Coast oil and lumber headed east. Manufactured goods and agricultural products headed west. The United States kept canal tolls artificially low, charging only enough to cover operating costs rather than profit-maximizing rates, subsidizing American producers and consumers with cheap passage. An independent Panama or private canal operator would have charged market rates and captured the economic surplus for themselves. But U.S. public ownership ensured American benefits. But after World War II, 3 technological changes destroyed the economic value of the Panama Canal to the United States almost overnight, with devastating finality. First, the dieselization of American railroads dramatically reduced the cost of overland freight, making cross-continental rail transport competitive with canal shipping for the first time in decades. Second, the interstate highway system, completed in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, created an efficient truck-based freight network that further reduced the canal's transportation advantage. Third, the rise of California as a major consumer market meant West Coast goods no longer needed to ship east. They could be consumed locally without any canal transit. By the 1,970 seconds, an American farmer in the Midwest faced nearly identical costs, shipping Asia-bound grain to Seattle by railroad versus shipping it to the Gulf and through the canal. The canal that had once been indispensable to American commerce had become merely one option among several, and often not the cheapest or fastest option available to shippers. Militarily, the strategic calculus was even worse. The canal that was supposed to enable American naval power had become a strategic liability and a tactical nightmare to defend. The original justification for the canal was simple. It allowed the United States Navy to move warships rapidly between the Atlantic and Pacific without the long voyage around South America. During World War I and the early years of World War II, this capability seemed essential, enabling the U.S. to maintain a one-ocean navy that could respond to threats on either coast. But by 1945, the emergence of the Soviet Union as a global superpower with submarine capabilities fundamentally changed the strategic equation for American naval planners. The Soviet Union could destroy the Panama Canal whenever it wanted using submarines, bombers, or saboteurs, and there was absolutely nothing the United States could do to prevent it. The canal's geography made it nearly indefensible, a long, narrow, vulnerable choke point with massive locks that could be disabled by a single well-placed explosive charge or torpedo. A 1947 Pentagon study concluded that relying on the Panama Canal for naval movement between oceans was strategically suicidal given Soviet capabilities and Cold War tensions. This meant the United States needed to maintain a massive two-ocean navy capable of operating independently in both the Atlantic and Pacific, with or without the canal. If the canal could be destroyed at any moment, then it provided zero military advantage, but required enormous garrison costs to defend against an attack that couldn't be prevented. President Truman, reading these assessments, bluntly asked his advisors in 1948, "Why don't we get out of Panama gracefully before we are kicked out by force?" By the 1960s, the canal was losing money for the U.S. government. Operating costs exceeded toll revenues. It was a net drain on the federal budget under President Johnson. But the real cost wasn't financial. The real cost was political. The Canal Zone had become an international embarrassment and a propaganda gift to America's enemies worldwide. The Canal Zone wasn't just a strip of land where Americans operated a canal. It was an American colonial enclave in the heart of Latin America, with apartheid-like racial segregation. 36,000 American civilians, called Zonians, lived in the Canal Zone in American-style suburbs with American schools, American commissaries, American laws, completely separate from Panama. Panamanians were allowed to work in the zone, but only in menial labor positions at lower wages than Americans performing identical work. A two-tier system based explicitly on nationality. Afro-Caribbean workers brought in from Jamaica and Barbados to build the canal faced even worse discrimination, completely segregated and paid less than both white Americans and Panamanians. The zone was surrounded by a literal fence, separating it from Panamanian territory. Panamanians couldn't enter without permission. It was American soil in perpetuity, bisecting their own country geographically. This arrangement, tolerable, perhaps in 1903 when American imperialism faced little international criticism, had become intolerable by the 1962 in the age of decolonization and self-determination. Panama's population watched European colonies across Africa and Asia gaining independence, while they remained unable to control a 50-mile strip through the center of their own nation. Student movements, nationalist politicians, and leftist organizers increasingly demanded either renegotiation of the 1903 treaty or outright American withdrawal from Panamanian territory as a matter of principle. The breaking point came January 9, 1964, in an incident so stupid, so avoidable, so perfectly symbolic of colonial arrogance that it made American retention of the canal politically impossible. In 1963, President Kennedy had agreed that the Panamanian flag would fly alongside the American flag at civilian sites in the Canal Zone, a symbolic recognition of Panamanian sovereignty. But American students at Balboa High School in the Canal Zone, inflamed by nationalist sentiment, refused to comply and raised only the American flag at their school flagpole. January 9, 1964. Approximately 150 to 200 Panamanian students from Instituto Nacional marched peacefully to Balboa High School to raise their flag beside the American flag. They were met by Canal Zone police and approximately 2,000 hostile American students and adults who surrounded the flagpole, singing the Star-Spangled Banner and blocking access. After negotiation, police agreed to let a small group of Panamanian students approach the flagpole while holding back the main group for safety and crowd control purposes. A half-dozen Panamanian students carrying their flag approached the pole. The American crowd would have none of it and nullified the deal by physically blocking them. Scuffling broke out between American and Panamanian students. In the chaos, Panama's flag was torn, either deliberately by Americans or accidentally in the shoving. Accounts differ wildly. The flag in question had deep historical significance to Panamanians. It had been carried in 1947 demonstrations opposing American military bases and demanding sovereignty restoration. News of the torn flag spread instantly through Panama City. By evening, thousands of angry Panamanians gathered along the border fence between Panama City and the Canal Zone. Demonstrators stormed into the zone at multiple points, planting Panamanian flags. Canal Zone police responded with tear gas. Protesters threw rocks. Then the police opened fire with live ammunition. Ascanio Arosmena, a 20-year-old student, was the first to die. Shot from behind through the shoulder and thorax. His aorta severed. Death coming within 2 minutes. He became the first of Panama's martyrs. As those who fell on January 9, 1964, and the following days were to become known in Panamanian national memory. The rioting spread across Panama and lasted 3 days. When it ended, 22 Panamanians and 4 American soldiers were dead, with over 300 people injured on both sides. Property damage exceeded $2 million. The Panamanian government immediately severed diplomatic relations with the United States and appealed to the United Nations and Organization of American States. President Roberto Chiari stated flatly that relations with the United States would not resume unless Washington agreed to negotiate a completely new treaty, replacing the perpetual 1903 agreement. The international reaction was devastating for American prestige. Britain and France condemned the American response. Communist countries had a propaganda field day highlighting American imperialism and colonial violence. The Soviet Union proposed a UN Security Council resolution condemning American aggression. The United States had to use diplomatic capital, preventing the resolution from passing and embarrassing Washington globally. President Lyndon Johnson, dealing with Vietnam escalation and domestic civil rights struggles, didn't need another colonial war in Latin America, generating international condemnation and student protests. On December 18, 1964, Johnson announced the United States would negotiate a new treaty with Panama to replace the 1903 agreement, the first formal acknowledgement that perpetual control was ending. But negotiations dragged for 13 years, through 4 American administrations, because no American politician wanted to be the one who lost the Panama Canal to nationalist sentiment. The political symbolism was enormous. The canal represented American technological achievement, American power, American exceptionalism, the superiority of American civilization over Latin American backwardness and incompetence. Giving it up felt like surrender, like admitting defeat, like accepting American decline. Especially painful after the humiliation of Vietnam and the trauma of Watergate during the 1970 seconds. Enter Jimmy Carter, a one-term Georgia governor and Washington outsider who campaigned for president in 1976, promising to restore American moral leadership and end imperial overreach. Carter genuinely believed the Canal Zone was wrong, a vestige of colonialism, a violation of Panamanian sovereignty, an embarrassment incompatible with American democratic values and human rights rhetoric. But more importantly, Carter's advisors convinced him that keeping the canal was strategically stupid, economically worthless, militarily useless, politically toxic, and diplomatically damaging to American interests throughout Latin America. Saul Linowitz and Ellsworth Bunker, Carter's negotiators, presented him with cold cost-benefit analysis. The canal generates minimal economic value to American shipping interests in the modern economy. The canal provides zero military value because the two-ocean navy exists regardless. Holding it creates anti-American resentment throughout Latin America, pushing nations toward the Soviet sphere of influence. Every dollar spent maintaining the Canal Zone garrison, every student killed in riots, every diplomatic crisis generates costs far exceeding any conceivable benefit from continued American control. Negotiated return would demonstrate American respect for sovereignty, improve relations throughout the hemisphere, remove a Soviet propaganda tool, and cost the United States virtually nothing materially. September 7, 1977. Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos signed 2 treaties at a ceremony attended by representatives from 26 American countries gathered in Washington. The first treaty, the treaty concerning permanent neutrality and operation of the Panama Canal, guaranteed the canal's neutrality and gave the United States perpetual right to defend it. The second treaty, the Panama Canal Treaty, provided for gradual transfer of operations to Panama with complete handover on December 31, 1999. 22 years in the future, the Canal Zone as a legal entity would cease to exist on October 1, 1979. Just 2 years away, ending 76 years of American territorial control over Panamanian land. The political battle for Senate ratification was brutal. 38 senators had already declared opposition, more than enough to block the required 2/3 majority for treaty ratification. Conservative senators like Strom Thurmond, born 12 years before the canal was even built, had fundamentally different perspectives than the Carter administration's strategic realism and cost-benefit analysis. Thurmond's response to Carter's appeal for support was blunt and captured the emotional opposition perfectly. The canal is ours. We bought it. We paid for it. And we should keep it forever. Ronald Reagan, campaigning for the 1980 Republican presidential nomination, made opposition to the treaties a centerpiece of his campaign. Attacking Carter as weak and surrendering American power, Carter mounted an unprecedented lobbying effort. His team made over 1,500 presentations across the country, explaining the treaty's benefits to skeptical audiences and hostile media. Carter personally tracked Senate votes daily, calling senators, answering questions, making modifications, trading favors, using every ounce of political capital to secure the necessary 67 votes. March 16, 1978. The Senate ratified the Neutrality Treaty by 68 votes to 32, exactly 1 vote more than the required 2/3 majority. The closest possible margin, April 18, 1978. The Senate ratified the Panama Canal Treaty by an identical 68 to 32 margin, again with 0 votes to spare and massive political costs to Carter. The treaties were arguably Carter's greatest foreign policy achievement, but they contributed directly to his 1980 election defeat, as Reagan successfully portrayed him as weak on American interests. October 1, 1979. The Canal Zone ceased to exist as a legal entity. American jurisdiction ended. The land became Panamanian territory under Panamanian law for the first time since 1903. The United States continued operating the canal through a joint U.S.-Panamanian Commission with gradual transfer of authority, facilities, and personnel to Panama over the next 20 years. December 31, 1999, 11:59 p.m. The last minute of American control over the Panama Canal, 96 years after acquiring it through manufactured revolution and gunboat diplomacy. At midnight, the canal and all surrounding lands, buildings, and facilities transferred to the Panama Canal Authority, an autonomous Panamanian government agency responsible for operations and maintenance. The ceremony was attended by former President Jimmy Carter, leading the American delegation. Witnessing the completion of the process he had started 22 years earlier at enormous political cost. And here's the remarkable outcome that vindicated Carter's strategic calculation. Panama has operated the canal more efficiently than the United States ever did in 96 years of management. Canal waters time. The average time for a vessel to navigate the canal, including waiting time, improved dramatically under Panamanian control, despite American predictions of incompetence. The accident rate remained stable. Maintenance standards remained high. Traffic volume increased. Panama invested billions in expansion that the United States had refused to fund for decades. In 2016, Panama completed a $5.25 billion expansion, adding new, larger locks that can accommodate post-Panamax container ships, doubling the canal's capacity and future-proofing operations. The United States today gets all the benefits of the canal without any of the costs. No garrison expenses, no operational costs, no political liability, no diplomatic embarrassment. 70% of cargo transiting the canal is bound for or departing from U.S. ports. giving America massive economic benefits without paying a single dollar in canal maintenance or operations. This is the perfect outcome of imperial retreat done correctly. Retain all the benefits. Eliminate all the costs. Improve international relations. Demonstrate respect for sovereignty. And lose absolutely nothing. Now compare this to Guantanamo Bay, the 45-square-mile naval base that the United States has held on Cuban soil since 1903 under an identical perpetual lease arrangement. The 1,903 Cuban lease and the 1,903 Panamanian Treaty were signed within months of each other, both imposed on newly independent nations with zero bargaining power against American coercion. Guantanamo cost the United States $4,085 annually in rent that Cuba has refused to cash since Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959. 65 years of rejected payments. Cuba has demanded the return of Guantanamo for over 6 decades. The lease arguably allows only a coaling or naval station, not a detention camp for terror suspects outside legal jurisdiction. Yet the United States maintains Guantanamo despite Cuban objections, despite minimal strategic value, despite international condemnation, despite it being a propaganda gift to America's enemies globally. Why keep Guantanamo but surrender Panama? The answer reveals the cold logic of imperial cost-benefit analysis and demonstrates when the United States will or won't retreat from territorial holdings. Panama had economic value in 1903, but that value had evaporated by 1977 due to technological change, rendering the canal strategically and economically obsolete to American interests. Panama had a functioning nationalist movement capable of sustained violence. The 1,964 riots killed 26 people, but everyone knew future riots could kill hundreds or trigger guerrilla warfare. Panama was surrounded by Latin American nations watching American policy closely, meaning diplomatic costs of retention extended far beyond Panama to an entire hemisphere of 33 countries. Panama had no value to American military operations by the 1,972nd, because the two-ocean navy existed regardless, and the canal was indefensible against Soviet attack anyway. Guantanamo, by contrast, has zero economic value, but enormous military value. It's outside U.S. legal jurisdiction, making it perfect for detention activities that would be illegal on American soil. Guantanamo has no functioning Cuban independence movement on the base itself because there's no civilian Cuban population there. Just American military personnel and detainees with zero political rights. Cuba is diplomatically isolated, so holding Guantanamo creates minimal costs beyond Cuban protests that the international community largely ignores because Cuba lacks powerful allies demanding action. Most importantly, Guantanamo is small enough and isolated enough that the United States can hold it indefinitely with minimal garrison costs and zero risk of popular uprising requiring military suppression. The lesson is clear: the United States doesn't give up territory because of morality, international law, or respect for sovereignty. Regardless of what official statements claim for public consumption, the United States gives up territory when the cost of holding it exceeds the benefit of keeping it. Measured in dollars, lives, diplomatic capital, and strategic value. Panama failed this test by 1977. Holding it cost more than it was worth. Guantanamo still passes this test. Holding it costs almost nothing and provides legal cover for activities impossible elsewhere. This is why empires retreat, not because they become enlightened or moral, but because they become rational and calculate that some territories cost more to hold than to abandon. The Panama Canal handover was strategic abandonment disguised as moral awakening. A cost-cutting measure disguised as respect for sovereignty. Imperial efficiency disguised as anti-colonial virtue. Carter's rhetoric about removing the last remnant of alleged American colonialism was sincere. But the decision was fundamentally economic and strategic, not moral and philosophical in its core logic. And that's why the canal transfer succeeded where so many other decolonization efforts have failed. It wasn't charity. It was business. Cold calculation, proving that giving up made more sense than holding on. Today, the United States enjoys full access to a world-class strategically essential trade route without shouldering any burden of operating it or any political cost of controlling it. Panama gains national pride, economic benefit, and full sovereignty. The canal remains neutral and open. American ships pay the same tolls as everyone else. Transparently calculated, legally enforced. It's a rare example of decolonization, creating a genuine win-win outcome where both the former imperial power and the newly sovereign nation benefit from the arrangement that replaced colonial control. But don't mistake this for a template that works everywhere. It worked in Panama because the specific circumstances made surrender rational, not because the United States suddenly embraced anti-imperialism or self-determination. Guantanamo remains in American hands because the cost-benefit calculation is different. The Philippines were granted independence in 1946 because governing them cost more than the strategic value of controlling them. Diego Garcia's Chagosians were expelled because the base had enormous strategic value, and the population was small enough to remove without international intervention, stopping the ethnic cleansing. Each case follows the same logic. Imperial powers hold what's worth holding and abandon what's not worth the cost, dressed up in whatever moral language suits the moment. The Panama Canal handover was Carter's proudest achievement. But it wasn't generosity. It was the United States finally admitting what strategists had known since Truman: this particular colony wasn't worth keeping.